Good morning, Metalheads here, and welcome to a new episode of the Metal Meltdown, and today we're looking at the 9th studio album from Nightwish, entitled Human Nature. Or at least I think it's called Human Nature. There are enough colons and periods and additional letters in this title to definitely convince one otherwise, but for now, until we're corrected, we're just going to assume it's called Human Nature. More importantly, this is the latest studio album from the Finnish symphonic and power metal band Nightwish, who've been kicking around for a long time, but I must admit that despite their success, despite their acclaim, I'm really only familiar with a few of their records. The reason for this shouldn't be very shocking to a lot of you. I've made it very clear on several occasions that power metal and symphonic metal are my least favorite subgenres of metal. I think they're perfectly enjoyable in their own worlds, in their own settings, and I got nothing against anyone who does really love those genres, but I am just more accustomed to thrash, to death, and to grind, and I just don't really get anything from power and symphonic metal most of the time. There are exceptions, obviously, particularly when you get to like some symphonic black metal and some thrash power bands like Holy Grail and even some of the more eccentric material from Striker. But yeah, typically speaking, this ain't my cup of tea, and I don't normally review it on the Metal Meltdown. But even I can't resist a new Nightwish album, particularly when this is proving already to possibly be their most divisive album of their career. In the last week, I've seen some reviews already here on YouTube from some of my friends and peers, such as AMP Reacts, The Metal Triss, Quest for Metal, and Review Nation. And while the general consensus among them was that it was a pretty good record, the comment sections for each of these videos is where things get a little bit more touch and go. The Metal Triss in particular said that the comment section for his review of Human Nature is probably one of the most divisive he's ever had in his time on YouTube. Some fans love this record. I've seen a few comments from people going, this is probably the best album they've made so far. They love how grand it is. They love how big it is. They love how multifaceted and dynamic the record is. I've also read comments from other people saying that the songs don't really have a lot going on within them. It's a lot of fluff. It's a lot of grandeur. They think it's kind of pretentious and the progressive flourishes aren't really necessary. And honestly, with this record being as mixed as it is, I think this actually puts me in a pretty good position, as I am somewhat neutral and lukewarm to the band, all things considered. As I'm not coming into this with the expectations and wishes of a longtime Nightwish fan, nor am I coming into this angry like some kind of jaded critic who can't understand the appeal in Nightwish. They may not be my favorite band in the world, but I'm not stupid. I totally understand why Nightwish are as successful and popular as they are. And with all this in mind, I'm just going to say it. Not sure how y'all are going to react, but we're already here, so let's just do it. This album, Human Nature, to me, is the epitome of what I would call a mixed record. As for every single thing it gets right, it seems to immediately get something else wrong. While I do acknowledge that there are some significant changes made in regards to how the band write and perform their material, and while I also acknowledge that, generally speaking, this is a mostly entertaining record, I am still somewhat puzzled by many of the decisions made on this album, and the usual problems that I have with Nightwish, for the most part, still remain. Some of these things are arguably cosmetic issues. Take, for instance, the sound mix. At times, this album is lavishly produced with almost this pop-like flourish to it, but at other times, we have all these synth parts that are transparently fake, and the guitar tone feels really compressed and flat and weak. But some of this musical flip-flopping comes from the very roots of the album itself. For instance, you have a number of songs on here that aren't just progressive in the traditional sense, they're actually quite complex and punishing. But then moments later, you'll have a song that isn't just basic and predictable by comparison, it is just basic and predictable, period, boiling down to the same tired 4-chord pop and rock progressions we make fun of all the time here on the Metal Meltdown. Except now it's been slathered with some operatic vocals and synthesizers and crazy guitar solos, so I'm supposed to think that it's bigger than it actually is. It's even quite mixed when you get down to the layout and basic presentation and marketing of this album. Human Nature even weirdly seems a little confused as to how it should lay out and execute all of this musical information. Because while the album does flow remarkably well, the concept itself isn't fully realized, to the point where AMP Reacts is trying to argue that it just isn't a concept album at all. I wish this was as simple as me saying that this is a great or a terrible album, but that simply isn't the case. It has a lot of great decisions on it, it has a lot of terrible decisions on it, and they've all been sandwiched into one very confusing and mismatched record that, regardless of how you ultimately feel, will require your patience. I will say that the thing that really stood out to me and the thing that was consistently great from start to finish in this album, including the orchestral sections, was that it felt like the entire band was performing and writing and working as a band. Nobody was buried in the sound mix or given shit material to work with. It's clear that this is a much more unified Nightwish than what we're used to seeing on some past records. And it's not just her technical skill either. There's just so much enthusiasm and confidence coming out of her. It's genuinely infectious. If we're looking strictly at her vocal performance, I would argue this is the best of her career. I also really like most of the progressive and experimental flourishes and how they're implemented into the record. There are a lot of cool ideas here taken from neoclassical, folk metal, old school classic prog rock, even some tribal, indigenous, and world music. Opening track music is a great example as to how some of these ideas are implemented into Nightwish's core sound, opening with flurries of mysterious tribal chanting and percussion, evolving into something a little bit more grandiose with some big string instruments, some big horn instruments, and eventually setting into a pretty complex, almost operatic melody with a lot of chunky riffs and a lot of the typical shtick that is expected of Nightwish at this point. Admittedly, I did wince and giggle a little bit when it came to the lyrics, particularly in the chorus, but all things considered, an incredibly strong track and an incredibly strong start to the album. The track Shoemaker is another highlight as well. In its early moments, it has this lavish energy that harkens to early 2000s gothic metal, but before it settles into that, it very quickly introduces some very complex and very heavy riffs. And going back a little bit, when I say progressive, I'm not just referring to the written and recorded music. There's a lot of stuff happening in the concept of this album that's kind of interesting. I think we're seeing a little bit more of a philosophical side from Nightwish as they're talking about the meaning of life and our relationship with nature, our relationship with technology, our relationship with each other. And I think for most of the album, it's displayed and represented quite effectively. And I like that this concept extends to the orchestral pieces on the second half of this album. And with that in mind, I'll even give Nightwish credit for making a 1 hour and 12-minute record that actually goes by quite smoothly. But it doesn't flow perfectly, and I guess this is where we now have to start getting into some of the problems of this record. While the performances are consistently strong across the record, the quality of the actual material flip-flops a lot. For instance, the track How's the Heart has to be one of the lamest and corniest 4-chord metal tracks I have heard so far this year. I was literally rolling my eyes through the entirety of this track. And speaking of corny, there are some moments on this record that are so gleeful and melodramatic that it literally feels like some shit out of a Disney movie. There were multiple moments across this record where I out loud said, this sounds like something that should have been in Hunchback of Notre Dame. The track Pan in particular borrows a little bit too liberally from the Pirates of the Caribbean theme, and the track Harvest sounds like something that could very well have been cut from Frozen 2 very early in development. I would go as far as to say that if Disney somehow ever developed their own version of The Hobbit for movie theaters, you could expect to see this song on the fucking soundtrack. It's so whimsical and joyful that it turns back around to just being kind of obnoxious and pandering. And then you have something like Tribal, which I would point to as the main reason as to why this album doesn't flow the way it needs to be. Because it doesn't even sound like a Nightwish song. It dips its feet so far into the tribal indigenous world music pool that instead of sounding like a Nightwish song, it sounds more like an abandoned Sepultura Soulfly song that some power metal band somehow got a hold of. I'll admit, it's still honestly a pretty enjoyable track, and it has some of the heaviest material on the record, but in context of that record, it does nearly bring this entire thing to a screeching halt. And while I like the idea of an orchestral companion piece, I just don't really think it's all that well composed, arranged, or thought out. Not a single piece here is very effective, and not just because it's very unintuitive and predictable, but also because it's just laid out pretty poorly on the album. It actually kind of fucks up what could be a pretty powerful ending via the track Endlessness. And more importantly, I just don't really see the point, musically speaking, to an orchestral album when you don't have an orchestra, when you have a bunch of synthesizers. Sure, you got a couple guys that can play a wide variety of instruments, but at the very core, you're not hearing a lot of authentic strings. You're hearing synthesizers. Call me crazy, but I don't think synthesizers are as integral to symphonic metal as a fucking symphony might be. Like I said, for every single thing this album gets really right, it gets another thing really wrong. This album doesn't just shoot itself in the foot. It shoots itself in the foot, goes to the hospital, gets the proper medical treatment, leaves the hospital, shoots itself again in the foot in the same spot, and then goes back to the hospital, and instead of confronting the problem, just chooses to recycle these solutions and these ideas over and over and over again. Making for, as I said, the ultimate mixed album. So with this in mind, I gotta give it the ultimate mixed score. Right down the middle, 2.5 out of 5. Out of 5. There are terrible decisions, which would rank as a 1, and there are great decisions, which would rank as a 4. You do the math, you end up at a 2.5 out of 5. There you go. I honestly have no idea how Nightwish fans will react to this album because they all seem to be reacting so differently to this record. It could be just because this album just came out and not a lot of them have had a lot of time to really process what's happening and everything feels so reactionary as a result. But nonetheless, as far as new fans are concerned, I think it would be safer to stick to those earlier records, or at the very least the band's previous record, Endless Forms Most Beautiful, which in retrospect is a much more cohesive and competent album. And if you really feel you need to check out this album, I think it would be smart to check out the individual tracks that I've mentioned and praised, and then see how you feel after that. It's hard to say right now how history will choose to remember this album, but for the time being, at least this new Nightwish album gives us something really juicy to debate and sink our teeth into, even if it isn't objectively good or bad. 2.5 out of 5. You've been warned. Approach at your own risk. Approach with patience. Sorry I couldn't clear the air a little bit. And that is it for the Metal Meltdown. I'm not an expert, nor do I claim to be, so what do you think? Do you like this record? Do you not like this record? And what do you want to hear from me next? Thank you for watching. Make sure you press subscribe so you get updates on the Metal Meltdown fucking immediately. And you have yourself a fantastic fucking day.